Welcome to our Building a Nuclear-Free World Talk Story series. My name is José Barzola from the Montana Institute for Peace at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Our talk story today is on peace building, the spaces in between, reflections on convenings in Honolulu, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki with Wiwik Dharmiasih and myself. And thank you for joining us to learn about the tragic impact of nuclear bombs. The talk story was part of a nuclear-free world, Building a Nuclear-Free World exhibit that was available at the Hamilton Library. Bridge Gallery at the University of Hawaii at Manoa till the end of April. That was hosted by the Montana Institute, the National Nagasaki Memorial Hall for the Atomic Bomb Victims, and the Hiroshima Atomic Bomb Museum. Unfortunately, with the continuous threat of nuclear devastation around the world, learning about and working to build a nuclear-free world has never been timelier. Building a nuclear-free world continues the Montana Institute's long engagement with public outreach on the nuclear threat, beginning in 1995 with the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There happened to be an exhibit. Same exhibit came out in 2018 and 2019 as well in 2020 for the 75th anniversary. Although the exhibit has now ended, we encourage you to continue our Beyond the Exhibit that is available on our Beacon link, and I will add that link in the chat in a bit, as well as it'll be in the summary of this YouTube video. Today, thank you for joining us to learn about how war and peace are often talked about as binaries, opposites, extremes, life and death, liberation and capture, good and evil. During Wiwi's visit to Nagasaki and Hiroshima, her biggest takeaway is that we don't spend enough time discussing the spaces in between. Join us to learn about the new ways that she has come to think about these events and their continuing relevance in peace building. We will do this through a series of themes, including victims and aggressors, destruction and development, outcasts and heroes, still images involving histories, as well as deterrence and production. Our special guest today is Wiwik Dharmiasih, who is a PhD student in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She's currently the grad assistant as well, right here at the Montana Institute, where she teaches a course, undergrad course on environmental peace building. She also lectures in the Department of International Relations at the Universitas Udayana and is a research associate at Dala Institute in Bali, Indonesia. Her research focuses on political geography, conflict transformation, and community-based natural resources management. She's worked on climate change adaptation initiatives involving local perspectives of change and supported disaster risk reduction efforts with a special focus on issues related to water, equity, youth, and women. So thank you everyone for being here today. And I'm gonna get started. I'm gonna turn it over to Wiwi, who will guide us along. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jose. Let me share my screen just to see if it's working. Okay. Can you see the slide?
It's still loading according to my.
Okay. It's coming here. Just let me know.
It's loading on this end. It's
oh gosh.
Just some technical issues here. There, not a big deal.
So it's not coming out.
It still says it's loading. It appears as though it has loaded from your end though. That's what I'm getting the impression of.
Yep.
Yeah, nothing here.
Okay. Let me
you can try to, I don't know, refresh it or oh, there. I mean, we can see it here. If you don't go into presentation mode, we see the first.
Okay. Is there any way?
Yeah, you could just go this way if you like, and just scroll down as you get through
Yeah.
slides.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. All right. So, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Jose, Maya, and the Matsunaga Institute for having me today. I plan to present for about 30 minutes, and hopefully we can spend the second half for discussion. So war and peace are often talked about as binaries, opposites, extremes, good and evil, right and wrong, life and death, triumph and loss, capture and liberations. And this past year, I have been fortunate to visit Pearl Harbor, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima. Along the way, I have gained unique insight into some of the most important global events in history. My biggest takeaway is that we don't spend enough time discussing the spaces in between, which led me to the title of today's presentation, Peacebuilding, the Spaces in Between, Reflection on Convenings, Honolulu, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. So in this presentation, I will discuss different perspectives on histories, how different events continue to resonate in contemporary policy and politics, and I will center my own experiences along the way. Let's see if I can, oh. All right, how do I do this?
You can probably just push
yes,
the arrow.
Okay.
And there you
the
go.
Arrow, okay. Yeah. So as a Balinese, I'm from Bali, Indonesia. Our symbolism is rooted in the idea of rua bineda, black and white, as you can see from the picture. But the philosophy behind this tapestry of lightness and darkness does not accentuate its extremes, but rather remind us of everything in between. The cloth is wrapped around sacred sites and objects, like trees, you can see in the slide, to remind us of life that transcends. We meditate on the extremes to remind us that they are inseparable, that they constitute a spectrum of the forces that are present in the world. Okay. In this presentation, I will share my reflections on the spaces in between and the new ways I have come to think about these history, divining events and their continuing relevance in peace building. In the past 9 months, I have had the opportunity to visit World War II memorials, hear stories of survivors, discuss with descendants and survivors of these sites and events, work with fellow students, teachers, academics, historians, museum workers, and citizens of different countries. We had unique opportunities to reflect on how we learn about this event, what they have meant to us over time, what we remember about them now, as well as try to explain how these stories evolve over time. I began to focus on the spaces in between to help better make sense and humanize this history. I'm especially interested in understanding how these stories continue to be told and as an avenue for peace building. I wanted to do a photo voice project where students in the class take photos and share their experiences. However, because of time constraints, today's presentation is really about my own reflection and discussion along the way. Maybe some other time we can do the photo voice project. So I organized my presentation into 5 different themes: victims and aggressors, destruction and development, outcasts and heroes, still images and evolving histories, and deterrence and proliferation. So I decided to break down the series of themes ranging from a set of binaries that I mentioned earlier because of my kind of like background as a Balinese and my belief in rua bineda. Victims and aggressor, catastrophe and liberation. The narrative that I learned from Pearl Harbor described the Japanese attack as the defining moment that led to the Americans joining the Allies and entering World War II. When I visited the Arizona Memorial, we entered exhibit entitled The Road to War, an Attack. We learn about the strategic aspect of the Japanese avoiding surveillance, the lack of preparedness of the attack, the chaotic moment of the bombing, and the galvanizing of Americans to reshape society and enter into the war effort. We are told that the threats from this attack represented a threat to democracy and civilization, the rule-based order, and progress. Now, as an Indonesian, we learn from an early age in the school system about our colonial past. We are told that we were colonized by the Dutch for 350 years, that led to a bitter struggle for independence, only to be overtaken by the Japanese, who occupied Indonesia for 3 brutal years from 1942 to 1945. I remember stories of my uncle who saw the Japanese first march down the street in front of our house. He described it as a symbol of liberation, only to make way to even greater cruelty and oppression. Our independence history is therefore very much linked to the story of the nuclear bombs. As Indonesians, we view our own independence and liberation as linked to the brutality that brought the war to an end. Through these narratives, we come to think of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as necessary evils that helped Indonesia gain independence. People of my generation, I'm probably not that young, however, learn about Pearl Harbor through Hollywood, such as storylines further depict the Japanese as the villains, and the movie focuses more on the love triangle, though, instead of educating us about the historical events. Visiting Hiroshima and Nagasaki in February, we quickly see a very different story of victims. Walking through the halls, we see terrible images of instant annihilations and generational suffering. These are the images that I took from the museum in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In Nagasaki, we met with Sohei Suiki, a 95-year-old hibakusha, who described of us his firsthand experience of the event and the way it changed the course of his life. The contrast of Southeast Asian colonizations and bomb survivor came together in a very interesting way. When a Malaysian student asked if what happened in Japan was because of the cruelty of the Japanese soldier in other countries, Mr. Sohei Suiki answered, "I think it is important for Japanese to be aware that they were not only a victim, but also an aggressor. And I was angry at Imperial Japan at that time." And for me, that dialogue was very important. It's kind of like a reminder that the people here from both places, like Japan or people in countries in Southeast Asia, also suffer from the brutality of war. Now, the story of victim and aggressor is also very complex in Hawaii. Prior to the war, ethnic Japanese had worked hard to advocate for their citizenship. Historical research documents how Japanese migrants or those with Japanese ancestry fought hard to advocate for the ability to integrate into society. In the early 20th century, Japanese were not allowed to establish places of worship or even teach their children their heritage language. Activism among plantation workers also led to some of the early efforts to unionize, which were undermined by the arrival of new networks of cheaper labor. And finally, in the lead up to World War II, and especially the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese in Hawaii were viewed with suspicions, were stripped of their rights, and the US actively rounded up communities of Japanese ethnicity in concentration camps. We heard of complex allegiances of those that live in both cultures, proud of their Japanese heritage, but firmly viewed themselves as US citizens. Okay. Now, after learning about the destruction and violence of the bombs, one student asked whether the Japanese view Americans with lasting hatred, bitterness, and shame. And this is where discussion of memory plays such an important role. One of our professors helped us to understand the politics of World War II and coalition of leadership that wanted to stay in power and do whatever is necessary to maintain control and not cede authority to foreign influence. We learn about how the relationship between Japan and the United States have evolved seen in terms of military relationship and development. At the museum, we also discuss a lot about how to tell stories of the war to a younger generation that has very few ways to connect with the condition of a very different era. One of the most humanizing stories that we convene around this semester has been the Sadako Peace Project. The power of this story continues to resonate in incredible ways around the world and is especially inspiring for its role in creating a social movement that are rooted in children. It is a powerful reminder for future generations to never allow such events to be repeated. About 70% of the victims in the Nagasaki atomic bomb were children, women, and senior citizens. Sadako was 2 years old when the bombing in Hiroshima happened. By the time she was 9 years old, she was diagnosed with leukemia. She was described as an energetic child who loved sports. We learned that she heard of an old saying that said, "If you fold 1,000 paper cranes, your wish will come true." She dreamed of living a normal life, but in learning of her fate, she wished for peace so that children will not suffer in the future. Sadako's story followed us everywhere we went in the past 9 months, and we carried this message through calm acts of folding cranes together with different community. We shared in Sadako's heartbreaking story as a reminder for peace, which we discuss among groups at Pearl Harbor, the East-West Center, and in Japan. In Hiroshima, we passed by the school she attended on our way to meet with student counterparts at AK University. We saw her monument outside the Hiroshima Memorial and saw different artifacts of her life displayed inside the memorial. Destruction and development. This is my next themes. The binaries under this theme of destruction and development led me to explore issues that took place long before the nuclear bombs exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Before returning to World War II, I would like to take 2 historical detours in Nagasaki. Upon arrival in the Nagasaki airport, I was surprised to learn of the Dutch influence in the city, which I immediately connected to the history of commodity trade and colonization in my own country of Indonesia. In particular, my attention was diverted to the port of Dejima, and I felt very fortunate to be able to uncover this history during my visit. Dejima, literally meaning exit island, is a reclaimed area in the bay that has been restored to its historical representation. It is a museum and tourism attractions that highlight the past relationship between Japan and the West. The island was created during the 17th century by the protectionist policies of the Edo period. It was the only port of trade for Westerners into Japan for over 220 years. The Portuguese first controlled trade relationship at Dejima, but changed to Dutch control. Among the recreated warehouses in today's Dejima, we learn about the global trade networks that saw people from the Dutch East Indies travel to this location. It not only connected the early developments of colonial power, but also showed the interactions that emerged from the spice trade and other commodity that traveled through a global network of relationship. I even saw pictures of old Batavia, modern-day Jakarta represented there. It will be on your right side of the screen. My second detour has to do with the hidden Christian site of the Nagasaki region, a World Heritage Site that includes 12 locations dispersed across the Nagasaki region. This site highlights the unique place of Christianity in the region. Initially, the Japanese were welcoming to missionaries and allowed for some influence to counter the impact of Buddhist monks, and serve as a way to improve relations with Western traders. The Kura Cathedral is also called the Basilica of the 26 Holy Martyrs of Japan, which recounts the violent history of religious oppression and marked the shift into the protectionist policies of the Edo period. At the Nagasaki Memorial Site, there is a lookout that suggests where the hypocenter of the bomb occurred. If you view the city from this location, it would be difficult to imagine that the nuclear bomb was detonated here 78 years ago. Looking out beyond the image of past destructions, there's a vibrant and bustling city. We learn about how the bombs were detonated 500 meters in the air to cause maximum damage. It was especially haunting to learn that Nagasaki was not the primary target for the second bombing. During the museum tour, we learned that Kokura, a key industrial center in Kyushu, was the intended target, but because it was an overcast day, the flight plan rerouted to Nagasaki. From our discussion, we then learned that the impact was not as destructive because of where the bomb was detonated over the city, and the topography surrounded by hills helped to contain the impact. There were nearly twice as many casualties in the flat delta plains of Hiroshima, and the extent of the impact crippled the city. Even so, we learned how within days, the railways lines had been reestablished and had become operational. It served as an important symbol that the state still continued to function even after so much destruction. After the surrender, Japan went under the security and protection of the United States and had access to capital to rebuild. This initiated economic development policies and a development mindset that led to one of the fastest periods of growth in history. Today, the world continues to admire Japanese industry, technology, and innovation as some of the most advanced in the world. And these technologies are represented in many of the tools that are integrated into people's lives around the world. The Japanese International Cooperation Agency, or JICA, is also very active across Southeast Asia and serves as a development institution that finances and provides significant assistance and engagement in infrastructure. Outcasts and heroes. I feel especially fortunate to have had the opportunity to interact with bomb survivors or hibakusha or other World War II survivors. Hibakusha has a very specific definition and refers to those who were directly exposed to the explosion created by the bombs. It only applies to individuals within a certain radius and proximity to the detonation and exclude those who enter the city afterwards. Individuals are required to provide evidence before they can be called a hibakusha. When we met hibakusha, they seemed like heroes of the war and were treated with special status by everyone. The media even showed up to document our discussion with them in Japan. However, this status has not always been viewed positively, and the experiences of hibakusha carried a lot of stigma that affected them throughout their lives. Hibakusha not only suffered from the physical impact of the bomb, but also its psychological effects. For a long time, hibakusha had to hide themselves. They were considered outcasts in society. They hid for fear of discrimination and the uncertainty that many felt by being exposed to them. The elderly hibakusha were also far more likely to be living alone. Women felt a particular shame because of their exposure to radiation. One hibakusha shared that she feared for her children that they wouldn't be able to marry because of the association with effects of radiation that might be passed down to future generations. One hibakusha also shared a story of personal guilt and shame of sharing water with the bombing victim. For decades, he felt at fault for giving this individual water that she believed led to his death. She finally forgave herself many years later after talking to a friend who helped her to explain that she was not at fault. I couldn't imagine the trauma and nightmares the survivors have had to endure. There were also stories of extreme courage. Some have been outspoken in nuclear disarmament campaigns. Here I want to shift to a different binary, one that is more related to method than it is to content. It is something that my colleague David Nakanishi covered in his presentation last week. In David's exploration of these issues and in his excellent video documentations, he explored the language behind the portrayal in this event and how it shapes knowledge and education system. In my discussion with him, I also began to think about methods related to the different ways we understand these histories. As I was thinking through my own ontological framing of Rua Bineda on binaries, I began to think about the binaries of portrayal, namely the differentiation between the still images that enter our minds and the evolving histories that reshape our thinking. We talk about how younger audience interact with these sites. Some explain that the experience is just like going to the museum. It is very difficult to get people, especially young people, into positions where they are reliving an extremely painful and violent past. We were told by teachers that they always start the semester when the bomb happens. On August 6 or 9, school children come to see these museums. Given this repetition over many years, the event begins to feel like it is somewhere in the distant past. This photo is taken from Nagasaki, the entrance to the museum. In our conversations, we talk a lot about time. Sometimes these characterizations are to the exact second and minute, while others take place over generation or even centuries. We heard stories about midnight before the bombing, the sirens, the radar. We would wake up from our dreams, the hibakusha shared. We didn't know what the sound was. We heard a lot about the specific time to the minute as it was a moment stuck in time at 11:02. Or other explanation of 2 minutes after the siren. Then it was 2 days later, the trains were up and running again. The timing was also important in what Professor Brian Hallett shared with us around the important timing that the bombings happened relative to the impending pressure of the Soviet Union entering into the Pacific War. Time series related to moments encased in memories that describe feeling of revenge, survival, and renewal. We were also fortunate to have discussion up to the present moment. There was one student who was also in my group who had recently left the Ukraine and was studying in Nagasaki. He talked about the shelling over the period of a week. It made me think that people experience war very differently. Some talk about its trauma and debilitating effects, while others describe this moment as periods of resilience. I remember when we sit as a group, each of us asked him like how he's doing and everything. And he looked at us and saying like, what do you expect me to say, that I live in fear? That I'm like stressed out? Yes, I do feel that. That's what he said. But after a week or two, it's my survival mode is on. It's like I have to live for the next day and the next day. So I can't have fear run my life. And for us, it was just like mind blowing to see that, see what he said to us at that time, because we were thinking people living in the war area or conflict zone would always live in fear, don't know what to do, and stressed out. But we forgot that they are also a survivor, that they have a fighting spirit in them. When I came to Nagasaki and Hiroshima, I was expecting a similar experience to my past visit to Auschwitz. I thought it would be quiet and empty, which was part of a deliberate attempt of the museum to ensure that sense of quiet haunting was maintained. In Nagasaki and Hiroshima, I was surprised by how much of the city had grown into this memorial site. Auschwitz showed that even if you escaped, you did not have anywhere to run. But in Japan, although there was a clear story of remembering, the message I took away was one of resilience, that through the ruins, you can grow and develop. And although you should not forget the tragedy, you don't have to constantly relive it. These are the photos I took during my visit to Auschwitz in 2017. The last theme, deterrence and production. In this final sections, I was driven in a different direction, which is related to the type of research I work on related to socio-environmental issues. During my time in Japan, we learned a lot about nuclear non-proliferation. Since 1945, a lot of advocacy work has tried to remind the world of the consequences of these weapons. Policies of deterrence have had key moments of success in the past, but have met with limited impact in eliminating nuclear weapons. We read at the Nagasaki Museum about the technology, capacity, and power of nuclear weapons available in the world, which would be enough to obliterate the world multiple times over. Just one of these weapons are much more efficient and destructive than the ones produced in 1945. Nevertheless, policy positions between countries are reluctant to give up weapons given the risk of an attack and the lack of an available threat to retaliation. Given this reality, I begin to look away from the policies of deterrence and non-proliferation to better understand the material impacts of producing nuclear weapons. I begin to search about the production of nuclear weapons and learning the destructive impacts of mining. Although the sites of the bombs indicate locations of warning, healing, recovery, and even tourism, the violence of nuclear bombs takes place in different forms in locations far away from this incident. In most cases, mines are built in frontier areas away from population. However, they're often located on indigenous land and have had damaging effect to water, the environment, and the livability of a certain location. Uranium mining and other radioactive material used for the production of nuclear weapons are not the only uses of these mined materials. Uranium is used for various civilian purposes, such as energy production. The World Nuclear Association showed that over half of the world's uranium production comes from 10 mines located in 5 countries, including Australia, Canada, Kazakhstan, Namibia, and Niger. This photo I took from the internet from a mining in Namibia. So my concluding thoughts, I feel very fortunate to have had the opportunity to learn about this time in history. I hope today's presentation, which I have presented through my own philosophical framings, highlights the need to move beyond binaries and humanize this past. I also hope that some of these reflections help to shed light on how this history continues to live on and gets retold in new ways all of the time. For peace building, it is important that we continue to strive for greater understanding across different people and cultures. Thanks again to the Matsunaga Institute and all my colleagues and mentors for putting on this event. I'm giving it back to you, Jose. Let me stop sharing the screen. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you for walking us through the the perspective that you're coming from. I really appreciate that. One of the things that I may be repetitive of is talking about conflict and how its perspectives that many times is what pushes us toward these conflicts, because we all have different lived experiences. And so I think these opportunities to delve further into uh, understanding the experience that folks have had to build some empathy and compassion, hopefully can help us find some understanding or common ground to explore ways together. I One thing that kind of lingered on for me was talking about the outcasts, and one thing I could think about was like who do we outcast today, that may be heroes in the future, and we don't need to have an answer to that right now, but if we reflect upon just history itself, how many other outcasts have we had who are now communities, who are leaders of nations and of various movements around this world we live in. But I don't know, just I don't know if folks in the audience may have any specific questions before I kind of get to we have someone in the audience mentioned I had the opportunity to visit Pearl Harbor a few years ago. Thanks so much for your presentation. Thank you for joining us, definitely. One question I always like to ask our speakers, especially as you're going through these very highly emotional places, and you even have the dichotomy of the Auschwitz. How do you prepare yourself? For anyone who may want to follow in maybe your footsteps or maybe going to some of these places. How do you, whether it's self-care, whether it's ways to frame your perspective, I guess I ask.
When I went to Auschwitz, that was my first visit to a war site, which I read from the history book. And it's a World Heritage as well, which is my areas of research. They kept the place as it was when the camp happened. And they tried to build a buffer zone, no developments are allowed around the area. So you have this, this dark kind of like feelings vibes when you enter the site. And I was expecting the similar feelings when I go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And another interesting thing also, I travel with my toddlers to Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And I was advised that was not a good move because it's it's a very depressing place, going to the museum, they may be exposed to these photos and everything. But then I was like, think that because I joined the Sadako Peace Project, I watched the videos before we went to Japan. There were children. A lot of these victims were children. And I know that my daughters will not understand when we go to these places, when they look at the images, they might not understand what's happening or what's going on. But I'm hoping that when they grow up, they will be reminded like, oh, I visited this place for a reason. My mom took me there for reasons, and I want to know why. And I think it's important to see or to introduce the history to young people, not necessarily children. Maybe that's a little extreme. That this history shape our future, and we live through that history. And I think when I arrive in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, when I visited the Hypo Center, and I was told like, this is where the bomb happened. And I look around, I was like, okay, this is not like Auschwitz. Like, I don't have that feeling. At first I was like, seems not right, because it's supposed to be daunting. It's supposed to be scary. But then as I joined a tour, have discussions with the hibakusha, with other students, it gave me a sense of resilience to see these changes, right? In a place that, yes, the bomb dropped here, but then we don't live it, we strive through it, we grow through it, we develop through it. And, to see all this development happening, it makes you realize, oh, yes, you don't have to live in that horrible moment. And you don't have to be remembering history through horrible ways. Through the story of resilience, I think it's more beneficial for young people to know that, yes, bad things happen, but you can come out with great things out of it. And I would also say that it was one of the most, because I have experienced the visit to Auschwitz and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that we sometimes don't see this space in between, which is why I presented today. And one of the conversations when I was sitting at the AK University with one of the students, she was saying, like, I work with the hibakusha. I'm listening to their story so I can tell their story, because they're getting old. They're not going to live forever. And she said, I want to keep the story alive so that people understand that thing happened, that the bomb dropped here, but then we grow out of it. We develop better from it. And that's kind of like a long answer. I hope that kind of answered the question, though.
No, thank you so much. I completely agree with we want to protect our youth, but unfortunately the reality of history is it's as you say, the spaces in between. I say life is complicated. It's not just black and white. It's not just one way or the other. Um, and no, I commend you. I think they probably won't remember their trip. They'll look at photos and hopefully something will be jogged. But if not, maybe there's a pilgrimage for them in the future to, follow those steps or to learn further, delve into the conversations and dialogues that can result from that. And it was a bit of I just have to say thank you so much for going on this trip. It does take quite a process. It not only it's not just traveling internationally, it's also a very emotional, time consuming. So thank you for making the time. And but yeah, it was very um, enriching to the soul, I'll say, from my end, anyways. Being able to share time and space, and yeah, and to see the dedication of the youth to be able to carry those messages forward in such grand respect and honor for that. I do want to be respectful to some of the questions in the chat. So someone mentioned, thank you again, we how would you propose we help young people to shift from flexibly back and forth between perspectives, and how can the recognition of the space in between help educators to nourish peace and justice dispositions in formal and informal education? It's like a two-part question, but
yeah.
take your time.
Yeah. Well, coming from Indonesia, like I mentioned in my presentations, I see the Japanese in a different perspective. For us, we grew up learning that they were colonizer and they were very brutal. So the bomb was necessary to liberate us. Without the bombing, the Indonesian probably still under, Japanese colonial ruling. And when I went to Japan, the discussion that happened between the hibakusha and the student, and I mentioned in the presentation, one student she was from Malaysia, and she was asking, don't you think what happened to you is because what you did to people in our places? I was surprised that she had the the courage to ask that question, even though I also have that question. But I look at the hibakusha, and he was old. He was 95 years old, and I feel like I can't ask this question. That doesn't sound right. But the other student asked that question, and the hibakusha, he was not upset. He was like, he kind of reminding everyone that people are not just one set of community. Like, the Japanese are not the same with their government. He said, the Hibakusha mentioned, like, I was also angry with the imperial state at that time. He was just a young boy, going to school, having dreams, and have to be the victim of the bombing. I don't think he was classified as Hibakusha though, because he was outside the bombing when it happened. He just happened to work, and then it was like outside of the 2 kilometer radius. But for us, that definition seems to be like so not right as well. Like, do you have to be within the 2 kilometers near the hypocenter to be called a victim? The effects of the bombing goes like so far more than that. Going back to that discussion, it reminded me that we don't have to cover the past, no matter how brutal that was. We should also accept that, yes, the Japanese were colonizing other countries. They were also very brutal. But we also recognize that they were also a victim in the war, the Japanese people. They were just like every other citizens in other countries that have to suffer because of the government's, I don't know, interests, or in power. So there is, during my visit as well, talking with these young people, I don't know, maybe because they're so young, maybe in their early 20s. I talked to one student, and he was like, "Oh yeah, we have to visit the museum every start of the semester." And he was talking casually, and I was like, "Aren't you supposed to be?" In my mind, I was like, "Aren't you supposed to feel like, like a sense of importance or urgency in knowing this history, instead of just making it just, oh yeah, it's just another site visit, it's just another museum visit, or another history that we have to learn." I think it's still very important for them to not just learn from books, but also from the elderly, their parents. The Hibakusa was outcasts. They were hiding. They cannot tell their stories. It's not, I think, if it's not because of their bravery to come out and to tell their stories, their experience and their struggles, we wouldn't know, what steps should we take for a better future. So I will say that to understand peace and justice, sometimes we need to understand that there's conflict and injustice. We have to recognize that they exist. And then only we can work together to go, or to find peace and justice. I hope that answered the question. I need to think about that too.
Thank you. I think part of it reminds me of the saying, you kind of need to lean into your discomfort if you want to,
Yeah.
truly grow. And because unfortunately we get so used to the routines, and after a while, whatever may be challenging just becomes part of our normal routine of life. And so how we want to grow and how we hope to be able to, find bridges, to build bridges with different communities and different folks, that's part of it too. So some other comments from the audience. I really like your thoughts of looking at this in the in-between spaces. How can we promote this perspective among people experiencing conflicts that tend to harden differences?
Yes, that's a very tough question. I think Jose and I are working on that too. um, very often when we look at places or communities with conflicts, we always simplify it's between A versus B. It's between a place and the people. It's between, like, the state and the local community and all that thing. But if you look very closely, these conflicts are like, they're layered. I work with the Matsunaga Institute. I had the opportunity to be facilitators through this, peace building process between, I would say, conflicting communities or communities trying to find peace among them. And it's not easy, because at first you will see that, oh yes, this is just between community A versus community B with different perspective. I think we need to look into that one community as well, because they're also like, there's women in there, there's men in there, there's young people in there, with and they have different interests, they have different way of seeing things. And I think the best way for us to kind of like not resolve conflict is to recognize the conflict, why it happened, why it exists, and the people or the parties, the stakeholders that involve in the conflict, and build dialogue between them, trying to facilitate or give them a medium to express their concern, their hopes and their dreams. I think that's the best way to try to find a common path for this people to find, like, toward peace building. It's a tough question, but I would just say we have to recognize that there are different interests and different people, different groups, even within one community, before we can see the larger pictures of the conflict that happened between that community with other community, or with the state, or with the place, and so on. I'd be happy to
Thank you.
More questions too.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. Yeah, it's layers, and that kind of goes into the whole, life is complicated, or the spaces in between. It's not as though one person is just one thing. There's multiple layers that makes them up. And so the community is built up of even more layers of that. And the longer trauma that exists there, the longer conflicts that have existed. I mean, culturally, as we move, forward, historically, we sometimes look at things that were done decades ago, and we're like, well, that would never be allowed nowadays in this society. Some things don't age very well. And so whether it's, just to mention things like the patriarchy that exists within certain communities may not be as well received in other ones. And it's part of it's just, trying to provide a space that is safe and where everyone ideally may be acknowledged and respected in an equal format or some. And one thing that you kind of mentioned, the conflict resolution aspect of it, it's a very popular word, and folks really love the terminology and throwing it around. And one of the things I really love to kind of throw back is, well, we need to move away from that, because that's not the reality of life. Nothing is truly ever resolved. And just, I know that's not what people want to hear, and it's not what sells. It's not what's good in business. But the reality is that the best we can do is manage conflict, have the skills that we develop. It's management. It transforms. And hopefully, once more, we can, explore some commonalities and ways to move forward and through collaboration. But there's never a true resolution. And I think for anyone who says, oh, yeah, what about this? There's once more, it kind of goes back to the spaces in between. So thank you for all these hard-hitting questions from our audience. I don't know if anybody else has any other words, any other thoughts. You're also welcome to unmute yourself. There's a couple of folks I don't recognize in the audience, so always good to get some new folks here. Right. Well, I just want to going back to what you mentioned a little bit about Mr. Suzuki and acknowledging, one is to the aggressor and the duality of it. Uh, and I love that just because many times we're blinded by, we have our blinders on. We're unfortunately many times like a horse with blinders and may not be aware of how we may be causing harm. So I think an opportunity to whether it's oneself or one's community. And it's easy to remove yourself and be like, that's not me. But then when you realize that leadership is supposed to be representing you, that's a problem. And one of the things that I also have taken away from this whole experience was, being able to, if we really look at conflict, war, battles between, countries for land, a lot of it comes from the people in government or military, those in leadership roles. Uh, but I'm going to guess that most likely, your everyday person that lives within those communities, the farmer, the person just, does their 8 to 5 job, they're not concerned about like, oh, I need extra land. We should be, pushing using the military to get some extra land. And so I think that's one of the things that kind of resonates from your talk about, being able to, and Mr. Suzuki kind of, resonated that about like, just because, you know, my country was doing this doesn't necessarily mean it represents what I wanted. Even though, especially in democracies, we talk about, those elected should be representing the voice of the people. So I think it's important as you kind of move forward and we look at conflicts that are happening. Thank you so much for that insight into the youth from Ukraine and those voices and how it also the dichotomy of how you got to move forward. You can't just be stuck on the fear and the trauma. It's there, but it's not going to help me get from point A to point B if I keep focusing on that. And I think about that so much for the Hibakusha who had survived an atomic bomb. For a lot of those folks, they just wanted to continue. And every time you hear a Hibakusha story, it it's about that moment that they experience life, in history, the trauma of the atomic bomb, which I think is wonderful that they're still around to share those stories. Um, One area that I'm always fascinated is like, well, what about after? What has life been after that? That once more, the space in between them, that historical aspect of life to now that you're in front of us sharing your story with us, what has your journey been? What has inspired you? What has motivated you? How have you loved? What have you lost? What have you hated? Like, and the few times I've been fortunate enough to share space with them, I love just asking like, what are you worried about? Like, what what does your everyday routine look like? And I think that is truly once more the filler that helps to the human aspect of it, not forget that we're all just human beings on this world, just trying to make it day by day, trying to balance, juggle work, school, family, just to, you know, get to the next step. So um I don't know if you have any closing words. If not, I will close out today's session. You've been wonderful, Wiwi. Thank you so much for allowing us to learn about, your experience, opening up about the lessons learned, today's dialogue, and letting us know how important dialogue is and to not forget about that. So thank you for your kindness and leadership as we've learned about the tragic impact of nuclear bombs. Last but not least, I want to thank everyone who's joined us on this webinar. I truly appreciate your interest and support here at the Matsunaga Institute in our Building a Nuclear Free World talk story. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.